This is Daniel Zilberstein. I'm an editor for Breitbart News, and I'm here with Senator Rick Palmer, and we will be having an interview. So, Senator Palmer, the United States is the world's largest economic powerhouse with a GDP higher than the entire European Union. However, the working and middle classes make up 70% of the U.S. population and roughly 15% of its wealth. Clearly, those in the lower brackets feel as though they've been forgotten, as clearly evidenced by President Trump's overwhelming support for them. How do you plan to address this?
One thing that's fundamental in my campaign is reducing government spending, and with this, we will leave it up to the states that have states to make their own decisions when it comes to their funding and the money and how they spend it on certain things. So when it comes to the working class, I know that states, I believe in the states and that they can support the people that are living there, how they need to be supported, because they know better than the big government. You know, the people sitting in Washington, D.C. don't have as much of a personal connection and don't know what it's like to be living in working class areas.
So you said that you would be cutting funding by the government. What programs or what stations will you be cutting funding?
My plan is to cut the education program. I will be cutting the commerce and housing and energy.
I see. Moving on to the next question. In the 1980s, the growth rate peaked at 7.3% annually. Ever since then, it has been on a steady decline, reaching its newest low since the market crash in 2008, residing at 1.6% in 2016. To what do you attribute this radical change in growth, and how do you plan to combat it?
That's a good question. As America has progressed since the year that you mentioned, I forget the exact year, when it was
in the
1980s. 1980s, yeah. We've had it seems a forgetful attitude when it comes to the growth rate, and I plan to focus my efforts on the growth rate, because that is an important part of American citizens' lives.
I see. And in the last question, you mentioned that you'd be cutting from education, commerce, and I forget some of the other things. How do you plan to uplift the economy if you're cutting from commerce?
From commerce, so the uplifting of the economy, like I said, we not only cutting spending when it comes to what the government is spending in, not locally, but nationally within our own government. It's also important that we are focusing on ourselves economically, and so something that's been happening and something that's been increasing our debt with the last multiple presidents is how we interact with international economics. And so something that we do, which is honorable but not economically successful, is help more than necessarily needed in whether it's when a overseas company fails, or whether when there is a crisis that such as the Syrian crisis, or recently I just wrote a bill that would transfer help away from Pakistan, because I believe that we are wasting money in certain aspects of international aid and in international economics, and I believe that we need to focus that back in on our at home, if that makes sense, and that will grow our economy.
So you're taking more of an isolationist stance as opposed to...
Isolationist, I like to think, is a little bit extreme, but in certain terms, yes, it could be thought of that way.
All right, I see. Moving on to the next question, we'll be talking about the minimum wage. A point of heavy congestion in recent years has been the debates over the minimum wage. Nationally, it has been mandated that the minimum wage is $7.25 per hour. Meanwhile, some states have gone up to $11 per hour, and some states plan to go even higher. On the other hand, some of the poorer states have minimum wages below the $7.25 per hour benchmark. Do you see this as an issue that deserves federal recognition and action? And if so, how do you plan to act on this?
Again, I believe that this is an issue that can be and should be left up to the states. because a bigger government is a less successful government, and when concerning yourselves with something that is unique to each state and how that state functions, I believe that it will get more muddled and more people will be upset and it will be less successful.
There's always the concern that if the federal government does not take action regarding the minimum wage, that people will continue to go below the minimum wage, as we've seen in several states. How do you respond to that?
That is definitely a fair point. Again, there's going to be fear in anything in leaving certain things up to the states, but I do have to fall back to my original beliefs, which are that of a bigger government is a less successful government. So when a state is falling below the minimum wage, I believe that its people and its senators and the people in that state government will be able to figure out the right thing to do for that specific state.
I see. Very well answered. Let us move on. We will be moving away from the economy now, and we'll start moving into stuff like foreign policy. Despite our allyship with both Saudi Arabia and Israel, our relationship with the Middle East has been steadily deteriorating since the start of our actions within the Middle East. Much of our oil is imported from the Middle East, and there are fears that a deteriorating relationship will cause business to move elsewhere, perhaps to Russia or China. What is your plan regarding U.S. relations with the Middle East?
U.S. relations with the Middle East are incredibly important. I am a very large supporter in the oil industry in the United States, and like you just mentioned, we get large amounts, most of our fuel from the Middle East. So I think that the relations there are incredibly important, and I think that part of strengthening that and also part of taking out our international activity while still keeping our bonds with those people strong is making sure that we are not too involved with their governments, because like I said, it's important that we focus on the problems that we have and the change that needs to be made in our government, while at the same time we do still need to continue our economic bonds with those oil companies.
I see. So you're advocating more of an economic bond rather than the military bond that we have
Exactly.
right now. Okay, I see. On a similar note, President Trump, during his time in office, attempted to move the embassy of Israel, an ally of the United States, from the current capital of Tel Aviv to the ancient capital of Jerusalem, in an effort to increase relations with them.
Yep.
This brought both Israel and the United States international attention, even causing condemnation by the United Nations and neighboring Arab countries. Obviously, the relations between ourselves, Israel, and the Arab world are pivotal not only to our oil supply, but to our power within the region. How do you plan to take action around this tightrope-like web of political intrigue?
Like you said, it's a tightrope-like situation. There are many strings that, if touched, will break in this situation. So I don't think that there's a specific hard-line answer that can be had to a question like this, especially considering I don't consider myself a expert on full foreign relations, but in a situation of presidency, I will have a team of people with me, and my ideas will be help to make more clear in situations like that. But with this specific one, I think that the moving of the capital from Tel Aviv to Israel was a risky and, in the end, negative move, because again, I think it's us getting involved with foreign affairs in a way that isn't purely economical and instead is interfering with the social issues of that area too heavily.
I see. All right. We will be moving on to a very simple question next. What is your plan to deal with ISIL/ISIS and other Middle East-based terrorist organizations?
Recently, in this interview, I have stated that I'm more against military action, but when it comes to in the Middle East, but when it comes to ISIS and the Islamic State, they are, I believe, a direct threat to America. So it's something to be handled with military care. As of right now, not necessarily military action per se, but something to be feared while at the same time know that we as America are still the greatest military presence on this earth.
So would you say that we should put more troops in the Middle East or get rid of them to combat ISIS?
Again, it's tricky because when Obama put more troops to combat Osama bin Laden and his troops, it created a void that ended up with ISIS, which ended up being a more threatening group than the Taliban and the troops that were under the regime of Osama bin Laden. So that's an issue that needs to be looked at incredibly carefully, not just a issue that can be said more or less. Instead, something that needs to be looked at what the impact of each move would be going on 5 and 10 years into the future, even past if I were to be elected president for 2 terms.
So you have fears of a domino effect happening?
Yes, exactly.
I see. Very well. Let's move away from foreign policy and let's sort of get into social issues.
Yep.
Immigration to the United States has been relatively steady for the last 30 years, averaging around 1 million legal migrants annually. However, 500,000 illegal immigrants are caught and deported annually. And we are unsure of exactly how many illegally immigrate to the United States annually, but it is at least a third of all immigration into the country. A few years ago, it was more than 50%. What is your stance on border control and immigration as a whole, and how do you plan to take action?
I believe that we do need to be tougher on border control, mainly because the system that's in place now, again, is inefficient. I believe that it's a large part of what's wrong with the American government because it's proof of how a larger government gets more and more muddled and less efficient. So leaving certain things up to how states want to deal with those that are on the border when we're speaking of Mexican immigration. But overall, I think a tougher stance is going to be more beneficial and create more jobs for our people that will ensure that we are getting those jobs to American citizens and that immigrants aren't taking them.
I see, but specifically more towards the coasts, you see a lot of the states that are close to the Mexican border taking up sanctuary status, where they are not reporting illegal immigrants and they are not sending them back home. And if we leave immigration up to the states, there's always the possibility that they will simply assume the similar sanctuary status and they will have open arms when it comes to immigration. Do you not believe that a central government is necessary for this?
A central government, like I said, is necessary, and I did just state a tougher stance is absolutely necessary. The reason that I had brought up states is because I wanted to be consistent, but I also wanted to make sure that a central government is working with the states, because as I have continued to repeat, each state has unique needs, because as we know, there are very different regions in the United States. That's part of what makes us so great. And if it's just completely ignored and there is one large policy placed upon an entire array of states, I don't think that it could be as successful as if we work with the states as a central government to accommodate their needs.
I see. Very well. Following the massacre in Las Vegas, the importance and prevalence of gun rights debates have been continually growing. How do you stand on this issue, and what is your plan regarding gun rights?
A large part of my campaign and a large part of me as a senator, what I've said as a senator is I believe that we need to, as America, bring back the Constitution. What this means to me is that we have in some ways lost our way as Americans and as American politicians in how important the Constitution is in our daily lives. And part of the Constitution is the Second Amendment. And although I can't ignore tragedies like the Vegas shooting, there is a very literal stating of the right to bear arms in the Second Amendment. So I believe that that is an important right for the American citizens to have.
In that case, would you be more in favor of repealing some of the restrictions we have on gun rights?
So when it comes to restrictions, it needs to be looked at that guns can kill other American citizens, and that's the last thing that I want is other American citizens dying, like we saw so tragically at the Vegas shooting and at many other events that aren't covered. But it, again, I repeat myself, it is a right for Americans to bear arms, so not necessarily repealing all of the gun rights, so anyone ever can get a gun, especially someone who has a record of using guns to harm people. But again, it's an issue that needs to be looked at a finer scale than it has been in the past.
I see. All right. Since roughly 2012 and perhaps earlier, there has been growing anxiety about race relations in the United States, specifically police relations to the black population, and similarly, recently, nationalism has been on the upcline. What is your policy regarding these two topics?
Something that I have a very firm personal stance on is the incarceration of minorities. I think that the statistics that have been coming out over the past 10, 15, even 20 years have shown that minorities are incarcerated at a much higher rate than the white majority, and this is completely unfair and un-American. And I believe in equal opportunity for all, and I think that the prison system in America needs to be looked at with a very fine scope. Because again, it's something that our government spends a huge amount of money on that we do not need to be spending this much money on this, especially considering we have an enormous amount of people jailed for nonviolent crimes that have had the rehabilitation that they need to become a functioning member of American society again, yet they're still stuck inside of a prison, and they still are using the government's money that is being given to the prisons to stay in the prison when they, like I said, could be a willing and participating member of society, paying taxes and these sort of things.
So then would you be in favor of, say, siphoning some of that money that we throw into the prisons into such things like rehabilitory programs?
Yes.
I see. Very well. We will be moving on to our last string of questions.
Okay.
We will be concerning the environment. The current energy production in America is largely coal and natural gas. While these methods are cheap and readily available, making them popular among low-income areas, they are not sustainable. What is your plan for energy production if you are elected?
Energy production, like I mentioned previously, I am a large supporter of the coal and oil industries. That's something that's important to our economy, as well as something that's important to the success of America. But at the same time, I believe that it is necessary for us to look into alternative fueling sources, not necessarily put a large amount of government money into, but instead something that private companies, I would encourage them to look into, and as well as giving them possible support from the government, and making sure that the reports about global warming are actually true, and that we as a nation are doing what is necessary for us to continue to thrive and continue to work towards the goal of maintaining our #1 status in the world.
I see. All right. How will you help the struggling coal miners in states like West Virginia?
States like West Virginia, again, the coal miners in states like West Virginia are an example of that middle to working class that we mentioned previously. And I said how I believe would be best to support them, and I think allowing them to have opportunities to use their skill sets readily are important, and I believe that continuing coal mining and things like that are valuable to the American people and to the American government.
I see. All right. Very last question.
All right.
Thank you for your time.
Of course.
What will your relationship with the Environmental Protection Agency be like as president?
It will be. It'll be close. Thank Rick. It'll be a close one, and it'll be something where I believe that I'll look at them very, not to repeat myself, but very closely. As I said, I still have my questions about global warming. I still have my questions about climate change, but it is something that, whether or not I personally believe it is true, the claims from scientists and the claims from the other side as well are something that needs to be looked at. So this is not an issue that I would at all ignore. It's something that I would work with the Environmental Protection Agency with to see what needs to be done truly.
Okay, I see. That will be all.
All right.
Thank you very much for your time, Senator.
Thank you.